assessing fraud, what vulnerabilities do you look out for?
Good morning, indeed. I think we need to just step back slightly on that question and have a look at our daily lives. So, whenever you do anything in your life, you basically conduct a fraud risk assessment of that particular project. So, let's say it's, I don't know, meeting somebody new. You go and you research them online and you make decisions as to whether that person is worthwhile you meeting, or whether you're going to cancel the meeting, or how you're going to react in the meeting and what strategies you're going to use to get out. So that kind of is a basic fraud risk assessment that you've done in your own personal life. Now, the problem with doing a fraud risk assessment on your own is that you very rarely are able to see from different sides as to where your risks are. So when you're doing a fraud risk assessment by yourself, you might say, yes, everything in meeting this person is good. But when you talk to your bestie, they turn around and they say, are you joking? The man's a maniac. What on earth would you be meeting him for? And they point out certain things that they've seen from an outsider's perspective that you haven't seen because you're infatuated with the person and with the idea of meeting them. And so then with that additional information that you now have, you can now change how you're going to react to that particular meeting. Are you going to make it in a more public place? Are you going to have your friend on speed dial, or is she going to phone you 10 minutes into the meeting so that you can claim it's your mother and she's suddenly fallen sick and you've got to go and see her if you need to get out that badly? And so that's kind of how a fraud risk assessment works. Now, in a business context, it's exactly the same. When we're running a business, we are blind. We see some fraud and we see some risks that are involved in our company. We know that a client could go bad. We know that an employee could steal. We know that cash could go missing. We know all of these things that happen in our business. We might lose stock. What are the things that we might do? And we put in controls to counter those measures. But the problem is that we're looking at it as you would be sitting on your own looking at a date. You only see certain things. You don't see a bigger picture. I'll give you a really great example. We had a company that we did a fraud risk assessment for. And one of the things that is prime in any type of fraud is management fraud. So one of your senior people getting involved in a fraudulent transaction, whether it be stealing money, procurement fraud, whether it be financial statement fraud, any of these can occur and normally occur at the really high levels of management. But they were so blinded to the fact that their management was absolutely clean that they refused to even contemplate in their internal fraud risk assessment that perhaps something could go horribly wrong at the management level. And therefore they had no compensating controls in place to stop management from actually stealing. And that, or from falsifying the numbers in the books, or whatever it happened to be that management were doing. And because of that, they had a gaping hole in their risk assessment. So while they'd thought of all of the underlings being potential thieves, they could not see that management was possibly their biggest risk. And that is kind of what we look for in fraud risk assessments, is where are the biggest risks, what controls are currently in place in order to mitigate those risks, And if we haven't got controls to mitigate the risk, what controls should be put in place in order to mitigate the risk?
So that's so interesting, Dave. I mean, are there any common misconceptions that people have around fraud risk assessments?
Well, people think that fraud risk assessments are there to find the obvious fraud. No, they're not. They're there to identify areas of your business which may be susceptible to fraud. So when we start off a fraud risk assessment, what we say is, with no controls whatsoever, what are the risks that are in your business? So let's say you're a business which takes a lot of cash. You would then have, your biggest risk would be somebody walking out after the shift with all of the cash. What are your mitigating factors that you put in place? You put cameras in place. You get the money handed over to a second person who does the count. You have different ways of pushing the money through to the back office so that it isn't lost. And all of these controls that we put in place then mitigate the amount that somebody might steal. So you might have a store which does, I don't know, let's say $100,000 a day in cash. You might say after every 10,000, that cash has to be transferred to the back office. And that way you're mitigating the amount of risk that somebody coming in would be able to steal from the tellers who are operating their cash registers at the time. So that's kind of what we do and what we're looking for.
And are there any internal blind spots that you find are quite common in businesses?
The blind spot I mentioned earlier about management is probably one of the biggest ones. That people never believe that management could rip off their own company. And yet it happens far too often. We see it happening all the time. And the biggest frauds are created by management. Most frauds are not created by management, but the big ones are. And that's because they have access to ways of stealing money. And they have the access to go up to a bookkeeper and say to the bookkeeper, I want you to pay 500,000 into this account, and this is what it's for. And the bookkeeper's not going to argue with the CEO of the company and say, no, I'm not going to do that. They're going to say, yes, sir, by what time do you want it done, sir? And that's where your risk is that nobody's actually checking. An interesting example that we can use in order to put this forward is a guy by the name of Kevin Hadassah. And Kevin was a really interesting character. He decided that he needed a job as an accountant. He was a fairly clever guy, but he didn't really want to go to university to study his accounting degree. So he went along and he said, okay, fine. He went to an employment agency and said, I've got a degree from an online university. And they said, okay, produce your certificate. And so he produced an email from the university, which he had actually doctored up himself, which said, you have this degree. Sorry, we can't, our printers down of the degrees are down at the moment. We've been told it's going to take 6 weeks to get it back, but please accept this as acknowledgement of your BCom. So he went, okay, great. Handed it into the employment company, who didn't check any further. He then got a job, and he got a job as the CFO of a firm. In that job, he decided it would be great to increase his salary. So he knew that nobody liked the managing director and that she was a bit of a battle axe and nobody argued with her. So he just wrote a bunch of emails down to the staff to say, give Kevin an increase or give him a bonus. And it was that simple. So when you're having a look at a fraud risk assessment, where was the risk of Kevin? He had full control over finances. He did the reconciliations himself because he didn't want people to know how much he was stealing. And there was no controls over what happened when the director gave an order in order for his salary to go up. Everybody just ignored it. Now that would be really hard for an internal company to look at and say, this is where our potential problems are. And that's where outside experience comes in, because we've seen things like this that have happened in the past. And we can say, what are your controls over pay rises? What are your controls over bonuses? What are your controls in this area? And that's what stops the fraud from taking place.
So when you do these fraud risk assessments, Dave, what does the size and the type of industry matter or make a difference?
Obviously, the bigger the firm, the more risks there are. But smaller firms have different types of risks, which are often more serious. So in a big firm, you have a lot of segregation of duties. This person does one thing, this person does another, that does another. So in purchasing goods, the person putting the head of the area will put a request through to the purchasing department to buy certain parts. When those parts are shipped in, they'll be received by a receiving clerk. When the receiving clerk will then fill in all the paperwork, it will then go to an accountant who will then pay the invoice. So you've got 4 different people involved in the transaction. In a small company, it's quite possible that the accountant will say, okay, we need to buy this in for production. He will actually go down to the receiving deck and actually receive the product, and he'll make payment. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? And you say, well, there's no controls. He would be able to say, we're buying this product for $20,000. He can sign the product in even though it never arrives, and he can make payment to himself. So when you have a look at that, that's kind of how fraud risk assessments manage to stop fraud from taking place.
Have you ever done a fraud risk assessment and actually uncovered fraud?
Oh, it happens all the time. It's honestly quite scary when people suddenly wake up to the fact that the purchasing manager has no controls over him. And somebody looks and says, we're a little bit concerned. We did a fraud risk assessment for a company, must be 15 years ago now, a transport company. And it was really interesting because we were sitting there and they were explaining their procurement process on a certain set of items that they were procuring. And they gave us it must have been an hour presentation on how why there's nothing wrong in the procurement system and why they needed to procure in this way. And we had a look and we started doing some numbers, and pretty quickly we came up with, just makes absolutely no sense. No matter which way we try to slice and dice it, it made no sense whatsoever. And from that, this asked us to investigate to see if it was a problem, and we worked out that there was a $20 million problem. So
$20 million.
from them thinking that they didn't have a problem to a $20 million problem.
That's crazy. So, best case scenario, somebody hires you guys and you do a fraud risk assessment and nothing comes up, but they are at least secured until, the rest of time. Worst
Well,
case
not to the
scenario
rest of time, but
for the time.
basically what we're doing is we're saying, do you have controls in place that will enable you to be able to have a stronger chance of protecting yourself against a fraudulent action? You Again, it is not a panacea for all types of fraud. And that if somebody's stealing, they'll be having a look to see how they can get around controls. And as many controls as you put in, if somebody's determined with a bit of collusion, most controls can be broken. And so, yes, you are trying to build a platform where people can't steal. But on the other hand, you're sitting in an area where if somebody really wants to steal, they're going to. And regardless of the controls you have in place, the only hope you've got is that the controls you have in place stop the fraud before it goes too large.
Okay, so that's quite is family owned businesses because it's quite a difficult thing to kind of say, you want to get a fraud risk assessment, but you don't want to upset your father in law or your brother or whoever you work with. Do you have any insights on how to deal with such delicate matters?
So whenever you have a family business, first of all, your risks are much higher because you have your brother-in-law running the company, or you have your sister running the company, or your brother running the company. You tend to say, well, they're my family, they wouldn't steal from me. But that's not always the case, unfortunately. So is there a reason for doing a fraud risk assessment in a family-owned company? Yes, most definitely. Will it ruffle feathers? Probably. But at the end of the day, you need to know that there are checks and balances in place to stop a family member from abusing the system.
So, on that, Dave, has anyone ever hired you to do a fraud risk assessment and the client ends up failing the risk assessment and they're the fraudster?
Yes.
No, you really? Oh, wow. How
It wasn't.
did you
It
get paid?
wasn't. It wasn't particularly a risk assessment. It was a client actually called us in to follow up on a wire transfer that had gone missing. And halfway through the investigation, it became apparent that it was a father and son team, and it became quite apparent that the son had actually been in collusion and stealing the money from the father.
Oh,
It
no.
made for a really tricky investigation, and it was one of those investigations where at the end we were told, put us down as an unhappy client, because they just couldn't believe that what we'd found was true. But we've everybody who's looked at it subsequently, everyone has come up with the same idea.
Oh, I always enjoyed talking to you, Dave. You've always got pretty crazy stories, and I know you've got a whole bunch more. And just to end things off, if anyone wants a fraud risk assessment with you, what do they need to do? How do you go about it? What can they expect?
Well, the first thing is to reach out on the phone and give us a call. And we'll set up a time to come and meet, go through the basics of what a fraud risk assessment would be, analyze the company and see what size, how many divisions, whether it's a single store or whether it be somewhere where there's 20 or 30 areas of manufacture spread out over the world. All of them need to have a fraud risk assessment done at some point. Whether you're a mom and pop or you're Apple, you still need to do a fraud risk.